Well, good morning, Gordon College. I am delighted to be here with you today, my friends, in many ways, and people that were on a journey together. Let me ask you a question. If you were going to have the opportunity to host a party, would you want to be a host or a guest? Okay, there's a big bash before you. What role do you choose? Would you like to be the host, or I hear the guests called out? I'm going to be honest. I kind of like being the host. I make good soup. Maybe you'll have some sometime. I like to sit around the table chowing on my good soup in fellowship with people. If you've been to my office, you'll notice that I have some treats in there. People come by just for their random chocolate along the way. Or maybe we've shared a cup of tea together. You know, when you host, you provide the space for people to sit together, to learn and to hear a little bit about life's journey, to share experiences. I also like to play host in the classroom. I like that role, to host a conversation and a dialogue with each other, that we might be able to talk to one another across viewpoints and understandings, to push back even on what I say in the classroom, that our dialogue might be enriched. I like to play this role of host. Guest? Well, being the guest can be fun. 26 years ago, this spring break, I was a guest at my then boyfriend, soon-to-be fiance, now married for 25 years. Yes! His name is Jeff, and I went to his home. And we ate like these amazing breakfasts. That family does breakfast. They'd make pancakes that blew up in the oven like this big, little tiny Swedish pancakes. Any Swedish people out there? Swedish pancakes? Amazing food. To be the guest is a lot of fun at times. I like to cross cultures. I could spend days watching the macaws in Costa Rica. I like to have different food. I love to go to places where I could speak my very bad broken Spanish with people. Some of you would see of yourselves as guests here in this Gordon community, meaning this isn't your predominant culture. This isn't your predominant country, which you know. So you feel often like guests, and I bet that you would tell us that being a guest sometimes is not so glamorous, that sometimes you feel homesick, that you like to be able to look at your family and taste your food and look across the land that you know and you love, that you call your home. A few years ago, I went to Brazil with a couple colleagues of mine, Ruth Melkovian-Hoover and Kay Cook, and we were going into the Legislative Assembly, and I had to make a little bathroom stop along the way. So as I was about to come out of, the stall, I found that I actually couldn't open up the door. No joke. We're in the Legislative Assembly for Sao Paulo, and I cannot open the bathroom stall. I'm turning it and pushing it. You know, you've been in the situation. I'm trying to lift up the door and pushing it this way. Nothing on that door is moving. They call the security guards. Everett speaking me to my Portuguese. My Spanish is not coming alive at that moment to be any help. And all of a sudden, I realize that I'm turning the lock the wrong way. Their locks go a different direction. All I had to do was go like this, and I was free. You see, being a guest sometimes can be a little awkward, uncomfortable, vulnerable. Do you want to be the host, or do you want to be the guest? Christian hospitality actually encompasses both those roles. Christian hospitality says that to be host is to understand who are the strangers and the vulnerable among us. To be host is to make room, to provide space for those who are in need, and to meet those needs. This is actually a distinct understanding of hospitality within the Christian tradition. There's also, within this tradition, an understanding of what it means to be guest. To be guest is to be the stranger among us. To be guest is to be the vulnerable, to receive the invitation and the gifts of the host, to find yourself paying attention to the host. But when we talk about Christian hospitality, which comes to your mind? For me, we hear more often about host, don't we? About the call for Christian to make space for others, to provide for needs. And yes, this is deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. In fact, it begins with God's covenant promise to Israel. They are actually given by their host, being God, the land, to which they are guests. They know from their history what it's like to be guests. They were guests when they were stuck in a land and enslaved. And God draws upon this history to remind them to pivot to be the role of host. In Exodus 24, he says, the scripture says, do not oppress your foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. So, as guests of a God who provides for what they need, they then pivot and respond favorably to others who are in need by acting as host. During Jesus' ministry, as he traveled around, Jesus acted as guest. He found places and homes, people that provided for his needs. He entered into places where, yes, he was sometimes sitting with those who were not the honored among them, the sinners, as we read. And as he does that, he would say, he would continually advocate, let's extend the table. Because this table where you seek to host needs to have room for the poor and the lame and the least among us. Jesus shows us a model of being guest. We read in the epistles a lot of emphasis on the role of host. Romans 12:13 is an admonition to the Christian fellowship. Pursue hospitality. And in it is describing making sure that among them there are no needs. And if there are, they should provide for them. We see it again in 1 Peter 4:9. Offer hospitality and do so in a way that you're not grumbling, that you give freely. Again, in Hebrews chapter 13, in a community that is fraught with trying to figure out how to follow faithfully in this faith. And they said, don't neglect the hospitality. And this is not hospitality within the community, but it's hospitality out. Hospitality to strangers. And the text says, you never know who you might be entertaining. Hospitality is woven through this host role. It's woven through the scriptures. And yet, Christ's followers are also described as guests. Those who belong to a new order. That our home is not just here. In Hebrews 11, in the row of the heroes of the faith, we read of Abraham and Sarah, who wandered to be guests in a new land. And they're described as those who never reaped the full promises of what God had. But it was okay because they are strangers, foreigners here on earth, longing for a better country, a heavenly city. We are guests in this order. Paul uses the word identity and citizenship similarly, that our citizenship belongs to another place, another order, where God, at the consummation of all things, will welcome us. We are guests in the order that presently exists. So there's this funny pivot that's going on in these stories, that we move from host to guest, and we need to know when to do that. I'm going to say rightly that we need to continue this heritage of thinking about Christian hospitality and the role of host. And it has a very important definition: to provide for the strangers among you, to provide for their needs, to watch out for the vulnerable, to make room for them at the table. That emphasis has been an important strain in Christian history. In fact, we find as early as the 2nd century that this practice was carried out by people who would create infrastructures in order to care for the sick, the vulnerable. We have a long history of missionaries and monastic movements establishing hospitals. Yes, catch the similarity in the word. And hospice and hostels, places to care for the vulnerable. This actually made a lot of sense this emphasis makes a lot of sense in light of Greek and Roman practices. Because for them, hospitality had more to do with social achievement. It was about inviting the honored to your table in order to benefit by being asked to their table another time. So it was about the different social structures and how to live with them. So this emphasis on Christian hospitality that reach out to the vulnerable, became really important. With all Christian practices, hospitality is one of them. Others would be Sabbath, testimony, different things that you're familiar with. With all of these practices, we need to imagine and reinterpret them with the core definitions in place, what these practices look like in our time and space. So I want to ask this question. What does hospitality look like here? And why is it that when we choose, would you rather be the host or the guest, that I'm inclined to be the host? We're going to look at 3 Lucan narratives this morning. They're original to the Gospel of Luke. And in each of them, I'm going to ask you to pay attention, not just to host or guest, but to the pivot. Because along these lines, you're going to watch that there's actually more fluidity between the guest-host roles. I'm taking my cue this morning from Pentecostal theologians. That's not my background, so I'm going to be guest in that tradition. Because what they do for us in their interpretation in the Gospels of Luke is that they draw our attention to not just historically what is it that Luke is unfolding, but what's the vision of the Christian life that Luke is unveiling. And they do this with an emphasis on paying attention to how people are attuning themselves to the movement of the Spirit. How are people paying attention to the movement of the Spirit? Jesus, in Luke 14, shows us he goes to many different tables, but that he was interested in instructing people on good host behavior. One time he was invited in Luke 14 to the Pharisees' table. And when he was there, they were confronting him and saying, "Hey, why'd you heal on the Sabbath? Like, this is outside the bounds." And you could see Jesus sitting at the table, kind of drawing back and shaking his head and going all Martha Stewart on him. And he starts to give some instructions. He says, "You are hosting parties where you hope there will be some reciprocation, right? That there's some benefit to you. But I tell you, the kingdom of God, you will invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. That the blessed are those who feast on the things of the kingdom, not those for whom we see there is value and benefit for ourselves." So there's this framework. Pay attention. Pay attention. What do you see in the movement and the pivot between guest and host? Story 1. Jesus enters the house of his hosts, Martha and Mary. As is customary, Mary takes on this role of host, and she busily prepares food for her honored guest, Jesus. But quickly she sees that her sister, Mary, is sitting on the ground by Jesus' feet and not helping with her, with the preparations that need to be done. Her anger brews against her sister. She's feeling overworked. She's feeling taken advantage of. There's Mary, and she, quote, sits at the feet of Jesus. So she turns with indignation to Jesus, and she says, "Hey, help me out here. Could you please tell Mary to kind of put herself in the place of what she's supposed to be doing? We're hosting you, Jesus. Could you straighten this out for me?" Jesus says, and I imagine his words actually coming across not in condemnation, but in compassion. "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things." And then he narrows it. "But few things are needed," and narrows it further. "Or indeed, only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. You see, in the Gospel of Luke, sitting at the feet of someone is a representation of the authority to which that person holds. And Mary has chosen. Mary recognized that there was a prophet in her midst, and that the duty of being host became a moment of a pivot to be in front of, to be the guest of who was really her honored host. Martha in this story can't actually imagine herself in another role. Jesus is there present with her too, but she's captured by the societal role and the duties, and Jesus narrows the options. He says, there's one thing to be paying attention to. I'm here. Give me your attention. This story actually comes right after two others, and all of them have a theme of resistance. We read of the priest and the Levi who resist extending hospitality to the vulnerable Samaritan. We read of the self-justifying attorney who's resistant to letting go of his possessions. And now we read of Martha, who's resistant to pivot in her role. Zacchaeus is an unlikely host as tax collector, deemed sinner. Hosting customs are what he seeks to do is be in the presence of Jesus. And Jesus beckons and he calls, Zacchaeus, invite me to your house, man. I want to sit at your table. The sinner's table? We don't actually read much about the table fellowship to which they enjoy with one another. But we imagine that something happened around that table. We can imagine a pivot on Zacchaeus' part. That he comes ready, prepared, excited to host Jesus in that space. And he pivots and he becomes the guest. And how do we know? Because the transformation that's bound to his testimony. Hear this in verse 8. Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have treated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times that amount. Zacchaeus, the host, chooses to pivot and become host Jesus' guest. And then he pivots again to be host for the vulnerable and giving away his possessions. 2 Christ followers are walking to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Emmaus, when the resurrected Jesus, their now guest, accompanies them. His identity, the guest's identity, remains unknown for a good part of the journey. And he actually sits with them and inquires about what's going on. He sees their state of mind and their stress and their frustration and their fear. And he asks them questions. Well, haven't you heard about these events, they say? And they start to wonder, how could it make sense? A suffering Messiah? At one point in the journey, Jesus stops, their guest, and he waits for an invitation, to which they reply. And they offer to host Jesus. Again, they're sitting at a meal together. And when Jesus, the text tells us, breaks bread, their eyes are opened. When they approach their destination, Jesus acts like he's going farther, but when they sit there, they find this urge to transform roles. Verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were our hearts not burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? The host again arrives, and these men, they recognize a moment to pivot. And as they do, and as they sit in the role of guest before the honored host, they pivot again. And they take this message to the vulnerable and to the weak. It's a message of salvation, confirming their fears and their anxieties that this Jesus who is resurrected is Lord. Christian practices involve aligning ourselves with the movement of the Spirit. They're not just things that we do because they're good things to do. We aren't just hosts providing for the needs of our strangers and the vulnerable among us, we don't just do them because they're the right thing to do. We do them because they align with the movement of the Spirit. And to be guest of Jesus Christ, guest of one another in sacred space, anticipates that the Spirit will be there to do more for us than we could ever do for ourselves. I'm sitting one evening with my daughter. We've just started a fire, thinking about getting dinner made. And we see an ambulance rush through the neighborhood, our quiet New Hampshire neighborhood. The first one kind of makes us curious. Then there's a second and a third and a fourth. And we are alarmed, rightly. There's a tragic thing that happened in my neighborhood that day. A woman who was a wife and a mother of 4 kids was suddenly killed. We don't really know them. They live at a far end of the neighborhood. I mean, I would recognize them, but I don't really know them. And so I'm deciding, like you probably would too, how might I help them? How might we provide for this family? I look through the newspaper the next day and I find the announcement of a memorial service at our local chapel in our town. And I think, go to the funeral? Here's an invitation for my family to be guests at a funeral of a family that we don't really know, whose lives have been completely turned upside down. And I found myself having kind of an inner conflict at that moment. I thought we could bring food, host. I could provide for those needs. I could invite them to the grief support group at my church. We could host them there. But at that moment, it was an invitation to be guest at a funeral in the grief of people that we actually don't fully know, to listen to their stories, to hear this woman honored, and stories that we don't share, that we don't have a part. But we were invited to be guests. And like Martha, in that sacred space, I was resistant because I'm more prone to be the host. Maybe you're like Martha. Maybe you're like me. You're resistant to pivot and be guest. You know why? To be the guest is to be the one that's vulnerable. To be the guest is to give up control. To be the guest is to be the one that makes a place at someone else's table and accepts the invitation to await the Spirit, not to usher in the Spirit. And I resisted. To be guest is to be like the friends of Zacchaeus. Because we aren't just guests in people's sorrow in the morning. We also have an invitation to be guests in people's celebrations. You know, when someone else gets the position you want or the accolade that you thought you deserved. When you studied for the exam and you got a less grade than the other person who didn't study so much. We're invited to be guests in the celebrations of others, and we find within ourselves, we're like the friends of Zacchaeus standing on the sign and going, sinner, judgment, you don't deserve it, I deserve it. And yet, we are invited into sacred space to be guests. One more. We're invited to be guests of other people's perspectives, like travelers on the road to Emmaus. You know, it's actually easier to play host and offer your perspective than it is to be the guest of the perspective of another. It's easier to maintain control of the conversation than to be guest and learn from the experiences of another. So I've been talking a lot about this pivot between guest and host, but I haven't talked much about how you do that. How is it that you might pivot? So I've heard that Kobe Bryant is actually the world's leading, has the best understanding, has managed and carried out being the best pivoter in NBA. But he wasn't available today. So I decided, we have the next best thing. I want to introduce you to Garrison Duvivier, who is Are you ready for this? The all-time leading scorer and rebounder in Gordon College's history. All right. Garrison. We talked the other day, and I thought, like, I had something to teach you about pivoting. Or maybe I just want to show it. I want to say, like, I know something about pivoting. I remember it from elementary school. You have to plant your foot, right? Yeah, and that's what he did. He gave me that kind of, yeah. So can you tell us about pivoting? I know you don't know. 2 things you want to tell us. What's the first one?
Just before we start, I'd just like to give a shout out to my teammates back there, and my coach of the year right here, Coach Murphy.
Coach of the year.
But without them, passing me the ball or missing shots, I wouldn't be able to get those points to rebound. But
you're very gracious.
Yeah.
We know this about you. All right, pivot. Tell me.
So when you first came to talk to me about pivoting, I was kind of confused as why my Christian theology professor was emailing me about how to pivot, but I was like,
it was weird.
Sure, I'll come in and talk to you about it. But the first thing is just the actual physical act of pivoting, and it's just being in a stance of being ready to react to however the defense is doing. And in this stance, you can either pass, you can shoot, or you can dribble towards the basket. And in those 3 ways, you're ready for whatever the defense is doing.
So when I hear that, I hear you describing dexterity. Like we have to be agile, we have to be ready, always prepared. Dexterity is required for pivoting, and I bet it takes a lot of practice to do that along the way.
Yeah, it definitely does. It's very quick decision making, and that's something that just more experience and more repetitions will help you improve.
Awesome. Tell me the second type of pivoting.
The second type of pivoting was, I thought specifically in a sport context, is just the pivoting role of each player, whether it's on a play, in a game, just the roles that need to be changed in order to help the team succeed.
So in that, I'm hearing you described adaptability. Like we need to we need to adapt to different roles based on the conditions. Yeah. What's involved?
Yeah, definitely. And as long as the overall goal of success of winning, we all love winning, is the goal, then your role might change in how that overall goal is achieved. And I think if you're very open to changing your role, maybe for instance in basketball, one game you're rebounding more, or one game you're getting a lot of steals, or one game you're playing a lot of defense, you might not score as much, or you might not do other things. But as long as you win and you're happy with winning, then that should be fine in whatever situation.
Because you're on the team. Dexterity, adaptability, you're the man. Thank you. So to practice Christian hospitality, we need dexterity. We need to be alert, present to the Spirit's movement among us. And we need adaptability. We need to be able to transition between roles. Did you notice that in each of those stories, the transformation occurred at the table? Because those Lucan narratives, Jesus is walking in, inaugurating a new kingdom. He's teaching women. He's eating and fellowshipping with tax collectors. He's embracing those who are scared and are weak, and he's bringing transformation there. And ultimately, though, that table fellowship points us to the eschatological reality, to the new order, which will be unveiled. And right now, you guys, we have the opportunity to ride the wave of the Spirit and to practice dexterity and adaptability in order to become better pivoters. Pray with me. God, you are good and you are faithful, and we trust that your Spirit is moving. Would you shape our eyes to see? Would you open our ears to hear, to know that your movement is here, that you might be calling us to a role of guest or host that might not fit quite into what our expectations are. But tune our eyes, oh God, so that we might join your movement in this place. And all God's people said, amen. Go pray at the bell for your teammates, your classmates.